Yes, thank you, Anne-Charlotte. Good afternoon, everyone. Just to make sure that you can hear me all right before I start presenting. Okay, I see people nodding. That's excellent. So I should now be able to move the slides myself. So let's move on. So what I've been asked to do for today is to provide a brief outlook of data spaces today from the policy and regulatory point of view, looking at both the EU and the global level, and then concluding by looking at the current challenges and where we expect the prioritization of those challenges to go in the next 5 to 10 years. So the European strategy for the digital age is articulated onto two main pillars. One is data and the other one is artificial intelligence. So for data, we have complementing documents. We have a policy document, which is the European strategy for data that was adopted back in 2020, that sets out the major goals as well as the tools that the Commission intends to use to deliver a single market for data. And this is done with the twin objectives of ensuring European global competitiveness and also sovereignty in an area that is seen as of strategic importance. The strategy is complemented by a legislative framework, and I have highlighted here the key legislative pieces of legislation because, as you probably know, it's a multi-layered and very complex framework. There are intertwined pieces of legislation, but the main ones that have to do specifically with data are the first three on this slide. So the Data Governance Act was adopted back in 2022, and it sets out the rules that need to be followed for the reuse of public or protected data across different sectors. It also defines the operations of data intermediaries. This is a new concept also introduced by the legislation, and the concept of data sharing for altruistic reasons. This applies to both personal and non-personal data. So of course, there is an interplay with other pieces of legislation that cover individual data like GDPR and the e-privacy directives. The Data Governance Act is complemented by the Data Act that entered into force earlier this year and clarifies who can create value from data and what conditions need to be met for this to happen. And then, as both these pieces of legislation are fairly technical, they are going to be followed by implementing and delegated acts, one of which was already adopted a couple of years ago, defining the list of the high-value data sets and the rules for publication by the member states. These are based on another piece of legislation, the Open Data Directive. Finally, the policy and legislative framework is complemented by the common European data spaces that we're going to talk about in further detail. So, in terms of data spaces, the Commission has earmarked a part of the budget for the financing of these spaces. So both the Horizon Europe and the Digital Europe programs include dedicated budget lines. And under the latter, the Digital Europe program, the Commission has launched a Data Spaces Support Center. This is a coordination and support action that will run until March of 2026 and really has the overarching goal of ensuring consistency and synergies between all the relevant actions on the data spaces that currently exist sector by sector. And finally, the Commission is also investing in a platform called Simple that will trying to ensure that all the different data spaces, regardless of the sector and regardless of the applications, are based and operating on a common technical infrastructure. This is a more recent development, the European Digital Infrastructure Consortia. So I just want to mention, this is not only relevant to data spaces. This is a new legal entity, or I should say entities, because there is going to be more than one EDIC that the Commission has decided to implement in order to make it possible to develop and apply multi-country projects in areas of strategic importance. So for the moment, there are two EDICs that are mostly relevant to data spaces, the Alliance for Language Technology that focuses on AI and large language and foundation models, and then the Network Local Digital Twins towards the Cityverse, which is perhaps not the catchiest title of them all, but it is going to focus on the infrastructure that is going to underpin the deployment of European data space for smart communities. This is actually going to be officially launched next week on the 4th of November. There is an event in Valencia. And then for those of you who may be planning planning to attend the Smart City World Expo Congress that will take place in Barcelona also next week, there are going to be a couple of sessions open to the public where this EDIC will be presented in further detail. Now, data spaces today, as you can see, this is a very complex and variegated picture. I am going to focus on the mobility data space here, but I have also included the link to the staff working document that was released in January of this year, and which really provides a detailed state of play data space by data space. So you can refer to that document for more information on what has been achieved so far and what is in the pipeline for each and every one of these data spaces. So I am not going to spend a lot of time on this one specifically because I know that Casper has some slides that go in more detail. But so just to go back to what I was saying earlier on about funding, legislative framework and policy framework working together to deliver, in this case, in the area of mobility, this data space really has the objective to support the achievement of a sustainable and smart mobility strategy. So it aims at facilitating the access to data. There is actually a typo on the slide. I see that the most important word of all is missing, so apologies. I'll correct that in the deck that we sent afterwards, but it should read access, pooling, sharing of relevant data for an efficient multimodal transport system. And so the legislative initiatives that are going to contribute to this are mostly revisions planned of existing legislation, but also the establishment of a common data set for the sharing of information related to freight transport. In terms of funding, there is a coordination and support action that aims at mapping mobility data domains and the different building blocks. There is a deployment action that is more focusing on use cases for data sharing of traffic and urban mobility. And there is a Connecting Europe facility study on the governance of this data space, which should be followed next year by deployment action. I am going to share briefly an overview of the time frame and next steps. I'm not going to read in detail all of this slide. I'm just going to mention that the strategy also foresees the launch of a mobility and logistics data EDIC, which is still under development. So we should know something about this in the coming months. So finally, to look at approaches that are outside of the European approach. Now, of course, as you can understand, this is just a very brief cherry picking of different jurisdictions' approaches to data. It is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but I thought it would be interesting to have a look at what differences there are between international approaches to data and that of the EU, because this will come back on the next slide when we look at the global challenges for the creation and the operationalization of data spaces and the competitiveness aspect. So the Chinese government approach to data has been to, first of all, very closely monitor and control data, and also to maximize its use for the purpose of economic growth. So in China, data is classified as a production factor, which means that all the different industrial policies across sectors also include rules for the allocation of data resources. As you also probably know, on the individual level, online anonymity is fairly limited, and there is an obligation for private sector to respect data localization rules. So the data needs to be stored domestically in mainland China and also shared with the state in fairly extensive ways. The other big economy of that continent, India, has a similar approach in terms of commercial data, but also an approach closer to the EU in terms of consumer and individuals' privacy. So non-personal data is again at the center of a strategy for economic growth, but complemented by data minimization requirements, as well as a number of guidance documents for the use of personal data. Again, India requires the private sector to store data domestically, and it also foresees priority access for local businesses. There is a national data sharing framework, and the country is also looking at defining data sets of high value in those areas that are deemed of strategic importance. Now, The UK is an interesting case because, as you know, until its departure from the EU, it had the same framework as the EU 27 and is now moving in a slightly new direction, but retaining the strong data protection framework that it inherited from the EU. So the UK has maintained clear data protection rules and tried to clarify the different cases in which both individuals and companies can access and reuse the data. But it is also planning to increase industry access to the data and is looking at the establishment of a number of regulatory sandboxes with the idea to support experimentation and ultimately attracting new businesses based on data exploitation. And finally, the US is also an interesting case because it has sort of two levels, being a federal state. So there is a federal data strategy, but in terms of data protection, this is left almost completely to the individual states. So you have states that have almost non-existent levels of data protection for individuals. And then you have states like California and Colorado that are forerunners in this field. The approaches to data use are also based on a sector-by-sector cases. So although there is a federal data strategy, the access to data is not approached in a very uniform way at the federal level, plus this level of state fragmentation that I mentioned earlier on. Okay, and finally, we can go to the challenges. So again, this is fairly simplified. And of course, also the idea of categorizing challenges only works to a certain extent because, as you can understand, they overlap and influence one another. But to begin with the technical challenges, we still do not necessarily have the concept of sharing by design. So when data is produced, this is not necessarily done already with a view of the use that can be made down the line of this data. So that means that it's not necessarily in formats that make it easier to share and to reuse, which is a challenge that still needs to be effectively addressed. Another challenge is that of the enforcement of the rights of ownership to that data, which, as you can understand, obviously overlaps with the legal challenges. And then there are the challenge of an increasingly decentralized storage approach, as well as the recurring items that I don't think will come as news to any of you of the data quality, ensuring that the data is kept secure, and of course, the privacy concern that I have already mentioned several times during this presentation. Now, to go into the legal challenges, I don't want to belabor the point. Of course, data protection is still a challenge, especially because in the EU, to return to our continent, there is still a gap between what GDPR provisions are on paper and the actual implementation of the regulation, as well as the understanding from both individuals and the private sector of the relevant provisions and how they need to be applied. This, of course, has an effect in terms of the business dimension related to data. So that aspect of global competition I was mentioning earlier on, this is by no means related to only data spaces, but as you probably know, we live in a moment where international trade is becoming increasingly fragmented again, and we are seeing a return to protectionism. So to mention again those data localization provisions by countries like China and India, this goes in precisely that direction, which obviously poses problems as to the interoperability and the shareability of data. The digital area is, of course, a very dynamic ecosystem, so the skills that are needed to keep up with the developments also can pose a challenge. And also for the business aspect, the commercial aspect in particular, we do not have many standards that allow people to make a correct evaluation of what price tag basically they would need to put on data. So that's also obviously a problem, because if you're trying to build a product or service that is based on data and you can't put a clear price tag on it, that is going to create some issues. And finally, there are some further issues that look different depending on what the local landscape is. So for cities in particular, we know that both at the level of citizens and at the level of the administration, there is a certain lack of internal capacity in terms of skills of the workforce. There is sometimes a resistance to change, which again, I want to underline is not by any means exclusive to data spaces, but is part and parcel of the normal digital transformation process. There is, related to what I was mentioning earlier about data evaluation standards, a difficulty in assessing the value of investment is needed. And then local authorities also have to play with a double level of EU-wide policies on the one hand, and then further fragmentation done by the regional approaches that can be very, very different from place to place. So I think I'm going to pause here, and I'm just going to open the chat to see if there are any questions, and otherwise I'm very happy to answer them later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for these valuable insights in terms of where we stand in the policy framework, but also with these comparative elements. I think it gives a clear idea also, what it means for more international kind of exchanges in that aspect. Are there any questions, remarks you would like to ask? You can either type it in the chat or raise your hand as well. I don't see any immediate question. So I guess, Chiara, it has been crystal clear, all the explanation on the data framework. I would have one from mainly a question that I would ask for local authorities in the room. How could they engage with you and with Eurocities on that topic if they wanted to and if they're not yet doing that?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction, the head of digital transformation at Eurocities, this means I coordinate the work of the digital forum, which looks, among other things, at the issue of data. So we have a dedicated working group, and I'm happy to be reached out to after this event to introduce people to the work of the working group. But generally speaking, for those of you who are already familiar with Eurocities, we have a part of work that is dedicated to the sharing of experience among different cities. So we work as a knowledge exchange platform, and then we have a part of the work that is related to advocacy. So going back to those pieces of legislation and the implementing acts that I was mentioning earlier, we are going to advocate in a new mandate for increase and facilitated access from local authorities to data, especially privately held data sets. So that's very, very brief, of course, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with those that are interested.
Indeed. So don't hesitate to reach back to Chiara on that topic if you're interested and if you want to have a say in this. All right. If there's no question right now, I mean, of course, you can also let it sink in and use any of our future Q&A moments to still ask a question to Chiara. But I would say, let's move on, Marion. Over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you both for this first presentation.